Well, hey, Todd Henry, it's such an honor to be able to sit down and have a conversation with you. I'm excited to learn from you today and for our audience to hear you as well. And why don't we just start off? I want to talk to you about, you're well known for the company you created, Accidental Creative. You've written multiple books. You're a keynote speaker all over the world, and you're influencing people everywhere. But it didn't start there. You were actually, you developed this company as a side hustle, is what I understand. And I just want you to kind of share the story of how did you turn this side hustle into what you're doing today? I think there's a lot of leaders listening today saying, hey, I'm doing something on the side currently, or I have a desire to. I don't know if it could be a full-time thing or not. I don't know the journey to get there. I think your story could help a lot of people.
Yeah. So I was the creative director at a nonprofit, and I was leading a handful of dozen people as part of my effort there. So it was a very full-time job, like probably 60 plus hours a week, a lot of nights, a lot of weekends, crazy hours. We had a couple small kids. We were in the process of adopting at the time. We were running a nonprofit, my wife and I, that was funding adoption. So it was just a crazy time. Right. And, as part of my work, I started noticing that, the people who seem to be able to create on demand effectively, meaning they could go to work and they were just like the highest producers, man, they could just crank it out. They all seem to have some practices in their life that they went back to over and over and over again. And the ones who kind of struggled and burn out and were really not producing at the same level were people who were just kind of shooting from the hip, And I also noticed that some of those high producers had been doing this work for a long time. I mean, we're talking like years or even decades. So I started distilling some of those thoughts. I thought, man, I just wish there was a place to share some of this. And this brand new, almost like it was like the clouds parted, like, and this brand new thing called podcasting had just been added to iTunes at the time. This was 2005. Okay.
Wow.
And Apple just started supporting podcasting. And I thought, man, that seems like the perfect medium, because I had kind of an audio background. I was a musician in my early 20s. I'm like, I knew how to record. I knew how to do the tech stuff. So I put this podcast together called The Accidental Creative as a side hustle. And I put it out, put it out and listed it on the iTunes store, put out like 3 or 4 episodes about, creating on demand and conceptual versus concrete and just some things like that, right? They were really, really bad, by the way, but is what it is. About a month later, I was looking for podcasts to listen to because I was really into podcasts, this new thing. And there was one called The Accidental Creative that was one of the top podcasts on iTunes. And my first thought, Doug, for real, was, oh no, I stole someone else's idea. I can't believe I didn't check first. Like somebody else already took this name, but it was my podcast. And it was one of the top podcasts on iTunes. And so I realized, okay, there's something here. And that's for any business owner, anybody thinking about starting something, like that is the first moment where you realize, okay, I need to start putting some effort behind this, is when you realize it's kind of starting to take off even on its own without a lot of effort. When that happens, you've got something. So I started kind of formalizing. There wasn't even a website. There was no business strategy. There was nothing, right? Because it's just a little fun little side hobby. So I started putting together something a little more formal in the background and started spending really from like 5 to 7 in the morning and like 7:30 to 9:30 at night after the kids went to bed, started working on this, trying to pull it together for probably about 3 years. And that involved putting like a little business model together where I could make a little bit of money in the background. It involved starting to, get some quality, web design and other stuff, because at first it was just like me basically creating all the art and everything. And so I started pulling some of that together and really working a lot in the mornings and evenings. And then this is kind of where the story takes a bit of a left turn. I had been interviewed for U.S. News and World Report by the business editor there because she had listened to the podcast. She was doing an article on creativity in the marketplace, and her literary agent found out about the podcast and said, "Hey, would you like to consider writing a book? Was that something that is ever of interest to you?" And so I said, "Sure." I reached through the internet and signed right there on the dot. And so we started putting a book proposal together. And at that point, I was starting to get invitations to go speak at some companies and things like that. So we were using all of our family's vacation time for me to go like fly to California to speak at Mattel, right? Or to fly to, speak at a conference somewhere. And basically like, that was kind of like what we were doing. I would fly out, speak, fly back, take a red eye, get off the plane and like go to work basically.
Wow.
Crazy stuff, but it's what you do, right? When you're doing stuff on the side. And I was starting to see, okay, this is where I'm headed. I know I need to be moving in this direction. There's a lot of traction. I've got now I've got a book deal is imminent. And so I was kind of in this place where I started talking with my wife, because I mentioned, we had 3 young kids, I had a very full-time job. She had left her job when we adopted our youngest, in order to be able to help, with now having 3 kids. It's a little different than having 2 kids. So I was the provider now, the sole provider financially for our family. And so we had a really in-depth conversation about what will it take for you to feel comfortable with me doing this. And we basically decided together, here's what runway looks like for us. This is what we need in order to make it work. And so I now had basically had an objective, a goal, which is when I get to that amount of runway, when I get to that amount of savings, then we can make this leap. And so took about 1.5 years, almost 2 years to get to that point. And that was when I basically, decided it's time to step out on my own and make this happen. And so now that was well over a decade ago now. And, been basically writing books and teaching and traveling all over the world and helping people to be prolific, brilliant, and healthy ever since then. So I've now written 6 books, taught, on multiple continents, spoken in, some of the biggest conferences in the world, which has been a blast. And books have been translated now into over a dozen languages. Podcasts has, 15 million downloads, something like that now. So, we've been, now we're at a place where it feels like we're experiencing the impact side of it, but it all started with those 5 to 7 in the morning and 7 to 9 in the evening, work sessions, trying to pull it all together.
Wow. Well, that's an incredible story. And just out of curiosity, when you launched, did it all of a sudden go up and to the right and you never really had any more risk or times that you didn't think you'd make it? Or did it take you a while to get that traction going after you launched?
So when we actually stepped out, when I actually stepped out into it, we had, I think, $11,000 of booked income. That was it. Which, is not a lot. It's not enough to really sustain a family. But it seemed like it was the right thing to do. It felt like there was momentum and it felt like the right thing. It felt like there was opportunity there. And I knew if I don't do this, I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life. If I don't try to make it happen, I'm going to regret it for the rest of my life. And I think, you kind of get to a point where you feel like you've got 1 foot in the boat and 1 foot on shore. And it's fine to get in the boat and it's fine to stay on shore. But if you keep a foot in the boat and on the shore, you're going to end up in the water. And I felt like the boat was separating from the shore and I needed to make a decision. And the decision I knew I would regret more was staying on the shore and watching the boat go. I knew I couldn't keep doing it part-time. I either needed to do it or not do it. And so that was kind of that was the point. That was where I was. And, to your question about, did it ever feel like, there were any hardships? I mean, yeah, when you're in business for yourself, every year feels like, okay, is this the year it's going to fall apart? Right. I was fortunate that my first 2 books did really, really well. And that afforded me a ton of opportunity. My 3rd book did not sell as well. And that was like cold water in the face, right? Because I thought like, oh, I've got this all figured out. You write a book, you talk about it, and people just go buy it. That's what happens, right? This is super easy. Why doesn't everybody do this? And then the 3rd book did not sell as well. And I realized, oh, I'm making some assumptions here that are not valid, that are not accurate. And so we corrected those with the 4th book, which sold well and so on. But then, the pandemic came and we had to pivot because live events were not exactly thriving during the pandemic. And so, I had shunned virtual events for pretty much my entire existence, my entire business career, because they felt like they would intrude on the core business, which is live events, being in rooms with people. Never in a million years did I think that virtual would become a core part of my strategy. But once forced to have to innovate, suddenly you realize, oh, there are different ways of doing things. And so, so I mean, I think every year has brought it's like unwrapping presents every year. Oh, what's going to happen this year? Oh, what are we going to discover this year? Or what's the hurdle going to be this year? It seems like every year there's one or two of those. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, it's been a tremendous journey, and we just feel incredibly blessed to be in a position where I get to do what I love. I get to impact people, and I get to meet people like you and talk about something that matters deeply.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, one, on the front end, obviously develop something on the side, work in the hours that you're not at your work, see if that develops traction. If it does, figure out what will this take to actually jump. Obviously, it sounds like you did the right thing. If you're married and have a spouse, make sure they're on page and sure they're on the same page. And then once you feel like you have 1 foot on and 1 foot on the shore and 1 foot on the boat, you have to make the decision to jump. Any other advice that you would give entrepreneurs looking to make that jump?
Yeah. So I think, the key thing about that you mentioned about the making sure your stakeholders are aligned is really, really important. When you're young and you have no commitments, responsibilities, you don't have stakeholders, when you're sort of in that position, often it can feel like you have the most to lose in those moments, which is the strange irony, right? Like I talk to a lot of people in their 20s who are like, well, I really want to start something, but boy, I just don't know. Like, I don't know if I should, because, what if it fails and everybody else is getting ahead and I'm being left behind? And I'm like, what? Compared to what? Like, what are you talking about? Like you could literally survive on peanut butter sandwiches. Like you could literally survive for like 3 years on that if you had to, like you have nothing to lose. Now is the time to go do it, man. If you have any idea, go do it. Like those jobs will be waiting for you on the other side because people want interesting, talented, driven, resourceful people. And if you've been out chasing something, trying to make something happen, you can always come back to the job market. But when you're 35 and you've got a mortgage and you've got a spouse and you've got a family and you've got these other commitments, you have to be much more calculated about how you approach those decisions in those moments because, when you're in that situation, you have stakeholders who are dependent on you. And so you have to make sure your stakeholders are aligned. And that was the big thing for us, was just making sure that we were aligned on what it would take to make that happen. But to your point, I think you have to be in a position of believing deeply in what you're doing. You have to have a vision for where you want it to go. You don't have to know where you're going to land, but you have to have a vision for the direction that you want to go with it. And I think most importantly, you have to understand the people that you're serving and what you're trying to provide for them, because the more precise you can be in how you talk about what you do, the more likely you are to resonate with other people. You have to understand to be able to communicate with precision the things that you're trying to communicate, or the product, or whatever is the problem you're trying to solve. The better you can communicate the problem to the people you're trying to solve problems for, the more likely they are to trust you.
That's so good. You've mentioned you've written multiple books. You have a new book coming out pretty soon called The Daily Creative. Talk to us about it. Why did you write this book, and what do you want people to get out of it?
Yeah. So, it's funny because I've been writing books now for well over a decade. And the one consistent bit of feedback that I get from people is, wow, where do I start? Right? Like there's all this. So The Accidental Creative was about how to structure your life to make sure that you're positioned to have ideas when you need them most consistently. Die Empty was about making sure that you're doing the work that matters. Louder Than Words is about how to make your work resonate with other people. Herding Tigers is about how to lead talented, creative people. Motivation Code is about discovering what drives you. And I mean, all of those are really big, meaty topics, and people would be like, I just don't know where to start. And so I thought during the pandemic, I had this idea that actually began several years ago as a podcast. I started this podcast called Daily Creative several years ago. That I would write a daily reader for creative pros with an idea, a theme, and a challenge or a question every day that would help people stay aligned and help them, basically ensure that they're doing the most important things every day. And so that was really where it started, was just people coming to me and saying, I love these books, but where do I start? What do I do next? And I thought, well, it would be great if I could just distill all of this down into daily bite-sized nuggets for people. So that's what Daily Creative is. It's basically a daily reader for creative pros, almost like a devotional, right? For creative pros, where it just offers an idea, a tip, a challenge. It could be leadership related. Sometimes it's mindset related. Sometimes it's like, hey, let's talk about assumptions you're making in your work right now, right? Or let's talk about how to connect you with your productive passion more deeply, or something of that nature. So I actually have been using it myself. It's been really helpful for me. It's funny because it's, I wrote it, but yet I still find that a lot of this is really relevant to me. I'm like, oh yeah, I am making things unnecessarily complex. I didn't even think I was doing that, but I am, right? So it's almost like a little time capsule that I'm now opening every day for myself. Oh, I forgot I wrote that, but that's actually pretty good. I need to apply that myself. So that's basically what it is. It's a daily reader for creative professionals.
We'll make sure we include links to that in the show notes. You mentioned your other book. We mentioned all of them, but Herding Tigers, I look at our society today, and in business, I don't think there's ever been a bigger need for creatives to be on your staff, no matter what organization you're a part of. And so, but I also know this is a leadership podcast, and talking to leaders, leading creative people for leaders can be one of the most frustrating things. And I'm sure following leaders that don't understand creatives can be one of the most frustrating things for creatives. What advice do you have for leaders when it comes to leading creatives and vice versa?
Yeah, so there really are two core things that every creative pro needs. The first is stability. Creative people need clarity of process. They need clarity of expectations, clarity of relationship, meaning they need to know that the process isn't going to change midstream, that you're not going to decide suddenly, oh, you know what, we thought we were doing this, but now we're going to do that instead. They need to know that you're going to protect them, that you're going to protect the time and resources they need to be able to do their work, so that they know how to manage the amount of emotional labor and discretionary energy they're putting into their work. So they need stability, like clarity and protection from you. But they also need challenge. They want to be pushed. They want to take risks. They want to try things. They need to know that you see them, that you know them, that you believe in them. They need you putting courage into them, pushing them, refusing to let them settle. So the problem is these two things, stability and challenge, exist in tension with one another. So when you have an environment that is high challenge but low stability, which is where a lot of organizations live, quite frankly, because they're trying big things, they're doing difficult things, they have few resources. So, hey, sorry, but we're all going to have to work 3 or 4 extra hours this week to make this happen. And sorry, but you're going to have to do it with about a third of the resources we should have for this project. When that happens, often teams grow frustrated, angry, disillusioned, because you're asking them to do something that you're not equipping them for. You're not giving them the stability they need. In other words, the clarity and the protection of resources they need to do their work. People and teams can live in that space for a while, but they can't live there forever. Eventually they're going to burn out, and talented people are going to look for better horizons. They simply are. Conversely, you could be in an environment with a lot of stability, but not a lot of challenge, meaning you have clarity of process, plenty of resources, but the work itself is repetitive. It's not challenging. People aren't able to exercise their creative faculty. And in those environments, often talented people feel stuck. They feel like they're not being pushed. They're not being given the opportunity to try new things, to experiment or risk, to develop their skills. And similarly, talented people are going to leave. So what we need to do as leaders is we need to understand that mix of stability and challenge for each person on our team. And it is for each person on our team. It's not a set it and forget it thing for the team. Every person on your team needs a unique blend of stability and challenge. So I used to have one person on my team who was total pro. He went on to, he left and ended up, doing Super Bowl halftime shows and like all this incredible stuff that he did. Wow. But, he would show up about 2 or 3 hours before everybody else in the morning. He would leave about 2 or 3 hours before everybody else, at the end of the day, and would just basically sit and just crank out work. And he was just like, just tell me what to do. Tell me what you need. Tell me when you want it. Tell me, how you want it to play out. And boom, I'll just crank it out. Right. And the guy was a total pro. He needed a lot of challenge, but not a lot of stability. Just give him a couple things and let him go, right? But the more challenging, the better. He would just crank it out. I mean, he was always the broad-shouldered person who could just make it happen. There were other people who needed, check-ins every day. You had to sort of like make sure that they have what they need. Hey, you doing okay? You feeling part of the conversations? Do you need to be a part of any other meetings? They needed more, I hate to say hand-holding, but that was kind of what it felt like, right? But there's nothing wrong with it. It's just what they needed in order to make sure they were producing their best work. You need to know that as a leader, that mix of stability and challenge. And when you get it right, then people are going to thrive on your team. But if you get it wrong, if the mix is wrong, then people are either going to feel stuck or they're going to feel angry, and you're going to be to blame, and they're probably going to leave at some point if you don't figure that out.
Yeah, any encouragement or practical tips, I'm thinking of myself, are visionaries. Visionaries are people who can be ADD. They see the next shiny thing and, hey, we were doing this, but now this looks really good too. Let's add this to the plate. Have you found anything that has worked? And I totally understand how that would burn people out and cause people to leave. Have you seen anything practically done where a leader put boundaries in place or gave people permission to actually say like, hey, put on the brakes, that actually prevented them from causing the burnout and causing employees to leave?
Absolutely. Every visionary needs an ops person. Every person who is the person who is the out front sort of casting vision, having new ideas person needs an ops person who can manage resources, manage the flow of resources, even manage communication. Because often with those vision, by the way, I'm one of those people, so I fully understand it. Not the ops person, the visionary person.
Right. Yeah.
I will have 10 or 15 ideas for every one that I can execute. And people who have worked with me are like, well, hold on, we're still executing idea number 2 and you're on like idea number 12, are you telling us that we're not supposed to be doing idea number 2 anymore? We're supposed to be doing idea number 12, because we can very easily get so far out over our skis and out ahead of our team. We need to make certain that we have somebody who can manage those resources, somebody who can manage the flow of communication, who also, by the way, can just, sort of reach up and pull the brake and say, hey, let's put a pause on the vision right now. Don't forget any of it. Record it. It's going to be useful at some point, right? Make sure you capture those ideas, but this may not be the best time to communicate that or to move in that direction. You need that person. And if you don't have that person, then you need to do a regular review yourself of, resource allocation, expectations, making sure those expectations are clear both ways. People will drop hints sometimes about an idea they have, and that will feel like a mandate depending on who you are in the organization. Just dropping a hint can sound like a mandate to somebody at lower levels of the organization if you're not careful. And you have to be really careful not to allow that to happen.
Well, Todd, with the time we have left, I want to do kind of a hybrid of a few additional questions I have that you can answer quickly and maybe a few lightning round questions. You've written multiple books. I just want to start off. Everyone I talk to wants to write a book. I've heard you in other interviews talk about how you don't necessarily enjoy the process of writing a book, but you enjoy having the book written. What advice do you have to aspiring authors to get published?
So I would say, number one, you have to have a compelling, precise idea set. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. Don't be a me too. You have to have a point of view. I was talking with another author at one point, and he was getting ready to write a book, and he was talking about basically compiling ideas from people he had interviewed at one point. And I told him, hey, that's fine, but those people all have their own books and they have their own platforms and they're out there saying those things in other places. But I know that you, through your synthesis, have developed your own ideas by synthesizing these other people's ideas. That is a unique point of view that would be valuable to people. And people want to know what that is. You need to have a point of view. People don't want a book of a bunch of other people's ideas collected. They want your point of view. They want something that's going to be influential. So my biggest encouragement, my strongest encouragement is make sure that you have a point of view, a very specific point of view before you start writing anything. And then the other thing I would say right now is, everybody is obsessed with this idea of, getting a publishing deal and having a book and all of that. That world right now is very flat. Meaning, for the handful of people at the very top right? It can matter to have a deal with a major publisher and to have distribution in all those places and access to all those media outlets and whatnot. It can matter to people at the very top. For the vast majority of people, and by the way, I would throw myself into that same camp as anybody else. The advantages of having a traditional publisher have almost largely vanished away from the equation. And the reason is you can find really good editors, you can find really good designers, you can find really good distribution, all of those things. You're probably, even if you're signed with a major publisher, you're going to be doing most of your own PR. You're going to be doing all the contacts with all the PR connections and doing all the interviews and all of that stuff. Like, even people who are with major publishers end up, there's this sort of idea that they send you a list of interviews and you just jump on and do those interviews. It doesn't really happen that way, right? It's more like you're sort of doing a lot of the hustling yourself anyway. So, if you have a book idea and you're waiting for somebody else to validate that idea, I would say start writing the book, and, for very little money, you can publish it yourself and do a little test market and see if it catches on, like with the podcast we were talking about earlier. And if it starts catching on, if you sell 10,000 copies, 15,000 copies of a self-published book, you're going to get somebody's attention doing that. If you out of the gate are able to sell that many copies, you're going to start getting attention. And at that point, you might start wondering, well, do I really even need anybody, right? If you figure out how to do that. Michael Bungay Stanier, I don't know if you've had Michael on your show, but is a phenomenal expert, wrote a book called The Coaching Habit. He'd written a couple of traditionally published books, wrote The Coaching Habit, published it himself with Page Two. And I think at last count, he had sold like 800,000 copies or 1 million copies, basically self-published. He figured out the distribution, figured out all of that. And just, it doesn't, if you have a good book, it doesn't matter. It's going to sell. It's going to sell.
So good. Quick answer. You were way ahead in the podcasting game, 2005. I thought I was early 2012. And now everyone has a podcast, it seems. Any podcasting hacks for us podcasters out here?
Yeah, I would say the thing I would really encourage you to consider is the easier you can make the production process and the more simple you can make things, the more likely it is you're going to stick with it. If your process is overly complex, if it requires too much of you, then it's always going to feel like a burden. So I would encourage you to consider, how can I make the production process feel like a joy? And that might mean bringing some other people onto your team. If that's not something you're good at, then you can outsource some of that and you just create the content, let them do the editing. I like to have my hands on everything from a podcast standpoint. So I haven't done that yet. I outsource other things, but I haven't done that yet. What I've done instead is just made the process so easy, so simple. We were talking about that before we hit record, right?
Yeah.
That it just makes the production process a pleasure for me. And the other thing I would encourage you to do is consider how you can repurpose your content. Don't just make a podcast. Consider every episode that you do a target for repurposing in other places, even if that's dropping quotes here and there, writing an article, summarizing. I was writing for Inc. magazine, and I would do an interview and then I would write an article about the key things I learned from the interview, and I would call it something else and it would feature the person I was interviewing, but it was basically like 3 things I learned from this interview was kind of the framework for the article. So be thinking as you're creating about how you can repurpose the content is another thing, and that will lighten the load as well.
So good. Anything else you want to leave leaders with today as we close?
Yeah, I would say, okay, so leading is about people. And I think it's easy to forget that the job of a leader isn't to get the work done. The job of a leader is to get the work done while developing other people to accomplish new and more challenging kinds of work, right? So your job is not to do the work, your job is to lead the work. So my big encouragement, I think, to leaders is recognize that every day you have the opportunity to plant seeds that are going to grow up into trees that are going to bless future generations. And those seeds that you plant are your interactions with the people that you lead. There's a Greek proverb that says, a society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they will never sit, right? And every day you have an opportunity to plant a seed that's going to grow up into a tree that's going to bless generations to come. The person might be sitting under a tree and have no clue that you were the person who planted that tree. but that's what it's like. When you lead well, your influence echoes for generations to come. So my encouragement to all the leaders is be a leader who makes echoes. Every single day, make an echo in the life of the people you're leading, and it's going to echo for generations to come, and that blessing will be passed down from generation to generation.
Well, Todd, this has been great. Thank you for all the seeds that you plant through podcasting, through writing books, through speaking over the world. I know you've influenced and made the lives of millions of people better. So thank you for your work, and hopefully we'll get to connect again sometime.
Thank you.